Models are under scrutiny on lots of things, whether it was the COVID models, whether it was to do with various climate science models. When people talk about demographic models, they say that these basically are pretty much always truth. Demography is destiny, and you can trust them. So, two questions in there. Yeah, we search around for the answers of a demographic renaissance, as it were. The first question being is, does that just come at some point for reasons perhaps unknown to us because it's just what we do as living species? And then the second question is why are demographic models seen to be bulletproof?
Okay, well, I'll start with your first question. What could actually give rise to, I like your term, a demographic renaissance. I think that's very good. I should have used it in my book. So
feel free to quote me.
I mean, again, I think it's pretty much gone to print now, so it's almost too late. It's the sense was, well, in terms of inevitabilism. So in the interwar period, by the time in the 1860s, British women had 6 children each, and then that fell very rapidly. By the time of the First World War, it was down to 3. And then in the interwar period, with all those things of modernization, the infant mortality rate started to fall, so people felt they didn't need to have so many children, more education, fairly primitive but still available contraception. And then in the interwar period, the 20s and 30s, the fertility rate both in Britain and Germany fell to 2. And that gave rise to a lot of alarm. And in fact, Maynard Keynes, the economist, was very concerned about this, and he's one of the relatively few economists who took demography quite seriously. And then we had a baby boom. The baby boom was different in different places. It was an Anglosphere thing more than a European continental thing, for example. And in Britain, it had 2 very distinct peaks, and actually quite interestingly demonstrated by the royal family. So there was the sort of Charles and Anne peak of the late 40s, early 50s, and then there was the sort of Andrew and Edward peak of the early 60s. And the shape was slightly different in America, but essentially, post-war, there was a baby boom. Now, why did that happen? There are all sorts of explanations for this, to do with a particular phase of capitalist development, to do with the war itself. Whatever the reasons were, it did happen. And then we moved to a low fertility era. So I don't think that it's inevitable we won't get a higher fertility rate at some point. But there are a number of ways for this to happen. One is government policy. Well, in my book, my penultimate chapter is what can government do for us? And my last chapter is what can we do for ourselves? So I am skeptical that government policy alone can resolve these things. And you get very conversation of very passionate people talking about how can I possibly have children, ... Housing's too expensive and childcare's too expensive, which I've already said, I think that's really important, but it won't solve the fertility problem. I think what's essential is people to have different priorities, so that if you can't afford to lead your lifestyle living one sort of way with children, you change that in terms of where you live or what you do. People say they want 2 to 3 children, but it's not that high on the list of priorities. So I think it's a kind of change of heart without wanting to sound too evangelical about it. Although today actually is the first anniversary of my becoming a grandparent. So my older grandchild was born a year ago today. So perhaps it's a day to evangelize about the joys of parenthood and grandparenthood. But in any case, it's all about, ultimately, whatever government does is relatively small scale compared to the priorities that people have. And how will you change people's priorities? You know, I can preach, I can get on my soapbook and write books, but essentially it's about what people want. And I think that's not going to shift by people like me coming along and ranting and raving. So it is down to what people's priorities are and how they organize and order their lives. And that a Renaissance. Now, can it be done without a religious revival? It's not something I particularly preach. I'm certainly not going around telling people to get religion, although I'm sort of moderately religious myself, but I'm not in the business of converting other people. But there is a sort of profound question which was posed to me by my PhD supervisor, Eric Kaufman, who's a good friend, who's put it very simply: can we raise fertility rates, or can fertility rates rise without a greater religiosity. And Eric wrote a very good book sort of 12, 15 years ago called Shall the Religious Inherit the Earth, in which he argued that high fertility, high retention religious groups had this very powerful exponential growth. So that if the rest of us don't have children, they will effectively, whether it's the Amish or the Mormons, less so the Mormons today, or the Haredi Jews, there are groups with very high fertility rates who have low attrition, who retain their young. Very small at the moment, but will and could grow exponentially, and maybe will. So that's a sort of, how do we get a demographic renaissance? And I would prefer it to be done without some sort of huge ideological shift in society, but maybe that's necessary. The second question is, why are demographic models bulletproof? Well, they're not entirely bulletproof, but if you think about how a demographic model works, if we want to know today how many 80-year-old Brits there will be in 20 years' time, we know who all the 60-year-old Brits are. So we could, simple maths. Well, not quite, because some of those will die, but we know what the death rates are for people in their 60s and 70s. So that could change dramatically. We have a sort of super COVID that wipes out older people. But broadly, we know who the 60-year-olds are today, so we know who the 80s. We could have more mass immigration of older people. And then the question is, well, to what extent are they British? To what extent have they, there are sort of fuzzy boundaries around identity. But broadly, most 60-year-olds today in the UK will be 80-year-olds in the UK in 20 years' time. Short of a pandemic, obviously we're mindful of pandemics, although COVID was actually quite small scale compared to some in the past. But absent of that, mortality rates won't change, life expectancy won't change all that much. We know, more interestingly, perhaps, how many 20-year-olds will be entering the workforce in a decade. And again, that could be affected by migration or, heaven forfend, a plague. But broadly, these things are known. What we don't, so mortality is quite predictable, short of disaster. What we don't really know is where fertility is going. And there was a recent Lancet study that tried to model it. But because it's becoming increasingly cultural, so as countries, as I was saying earlier, move out of that process that, say, a country like China's been in of urbanizing and getting wealthier and getting mass literacy and very large-scale university education. Once you're through that, if it's down to culture, it's really hard to map the cultural shifts and how they will in turn map onto fertility rates. So that's the big unknown. And over in Africa, for example, the big unknown at a global level is how fast African fertility rates will move. And Africa's it's an enormous continent with much variety. So Ethiopia, Kenya have made great strides in getting their fertility rates down. North Africa, South Africa and its neighbors, it's not that high. It's in the sort of 3 level. It's that great swathe of Central and West Africa where it's still very, very high. They're still very, very behind in terms of socioeconomic development. That's the big question for global demography. So there are certain things you can say in demography with a degree of certainty, and that's unusual in the social sciences. So how big will the British population be in 10 years' time? Obviously subject to migration is much easier to model than how big will the British economy be. There makes things about demography which are predictable because a lot of the facts about demography in the future are already on the ground now. But the really interesting things are the things that are not extremely predictable, like where will fertility rates go? I mean, my sense, although I would like to see the British fertility rate drift up back towards 2 and above, is that if I look at the culture of Generation Z and their beliefs and their norms, they're not necessarily antenatal, but I don't think they map onto early family formation and a reasonably large number of children. So I suspect that as Generation Z become a larger and larger share of the cohort of childbearing people, the fertility rate in Britain will continue to go down, and it has actually been tumbling over the last few years, and I think it will continue to do so.